Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree. Now I'm still doing my collector's guide series of videos, so I will do a more in-depth look at the Dreamcast, the Sega Dreamcast as a console. You know, who's it for, who should want it, blah blah blah. But today we're not doing that. Today, this time, I'm just getting into my feelings and experiences with the Dreamcast and why I despise this machine. So from a Sega fan vantage point, I want to respect what the Dreamcast did because it was Sega's last console. Because I'm a huge fan of the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD, the 32X, the Sega Saturn, the Nomad, the Game Gear. Sega's got a lot of stuff I love, but the Dreamcast is not one of the machines they made that I have an affinity for. And it kind of bums me out that they went out on such a flat note, because their previous console generations, they were competitive. The Saturn didn't compete financially with the PlayStation, but hardware-wise, it was on par with the PlayStation. Likewise, the Genesis did actually compete financially with the Super NES, and it was technologically on par with the Super NES, more or less. The Dreamcast is inferior to the machines that it was trying to compete against. It was released too early in the generation. Some say ahead of its time, but I can't say it's ahead of its time when the three machines that replaced it were infinitely more superior in every way. Technologically, software library, capabilities, features, etc. Like, they just were. They were better machines in every way. But that's not my problem with the Dreamcast, because, you know, I love the GameCube, and it's not like, you know, technologically, you know, I mean, it's not necessarily up to snuff with the PS2 or the Xbox. Graphically, yes, but features-wise, no, not by a long shot. And I can't really shit on the Dreamcast software library, because while most of the titles released on the Dreamcast are actually good games, don't get me wrong, they are good games, like 60 to 70% of them are available on other consoles. And I don't just mean, like, you know, when Sega discontinued the Dreamcast, they immediately, as fast as they could, ported their Dreamcast hits over to PS2, GameCube, and Xbox as fast as they could, because they were trying to recoup their losses. But also, at the time, the games that were released for it, its contemporary competitors, the N64, the PlayStation 1, which were technologically inferior machines to the Dreamcast, had better software libraries. There were games that were released on the PS1, the N64, and the Dreamcast, and the PS1 and the N64 versions are the better version of the game. The Dreamcast version may have, you know, higher resolution. It may have, you know, like, more, I don't know, sometimes, you know, a higher frame rate, little things like that. But, like, the other versions are the better versions. They've got more content, or they're the more complete version of the game. The Dreamcast version, its quote-unquote advantage or selling point is the prettier graphics, but we all know graphics don't mean shit. Now, the Dreamcast, I have another issue with it, and that's the fact that it killed the Saturn, and it literally did. I know Sega's financial troubles, I know the history behind the Saturn and everything, but just as a fan, someone who loved the Saturn and was saving up to buy one, because I already had the N64, I already had the PlayStation, I already had the Genesis and the SNES. I was saving up money to buy a Dreamcast, or excuse me, Saturn, Sega Saturn. And then to find out that not only had it been discontinued a year earlier than it should have been, but also it was discontinued so that they could focus on this new, allegedly next-gen machine, which I was looking at, and I was like, okay, graphically I'm impressed, but at the same time I'm like, I'm pissed. I'm angry. Now let's talk about the Dreamcast software for a minute. The Dreamcast was designed by Sega using their, basically using the hardware in their arcade board, the Naomi board, more or less. It was designed specifically to bring arcade games home. Now, the secondary feature that they built in, they had a working relationship with Microsoft. They created a specific version of the Windows operating system, Windows CE, that some Dreamcast games could run on, with the express intended purpose of making it allegedly easier to port games to and from the Dreamcast and the PC. So a game could be designed for the PC and seamlessly ported to the Dreamcast, and a game could be designed for the Dreamcast and seamlessly ported to the PC, and etc., vice versa. So Sega was making an attempt to recognize that, yeah, arcades are dead, and we need to get out of the arcade business and focus on this new philosophy of games, story-driven games that PlayStation made popular. Because if you look at the PlayStation, while there are a few, I'd say 36 rock-solid arcade games on the PlayStation, out of its 1,500 software library, only like 40 or 50 games total were arcade ports. Everything else were either original software or PC ports. This is very important because, like I talked about in my arcade video recently, arcades were dead by 1997. Like, dead and buried by 1997. Sega was still manufacturing arcade machines, but nobody else was. Konami was putting out like 1 or 2 a year. Namco was limping along, but everybody else had left the market because they saw the writing on the wall. The nail was in the coffin. They were throwing the dirt on the coffin that was already underground. It was fucking dead. The business was dead. It would later get resurrected as sort of a zombie corpse, which is what we have today, but it's not what we had back in the 80s and 90s. But Sega, for an inexplicable reason, was still arcade first. Now, from a business standpoint, it made sense for Sega because they were the king of arcades. They made all their money from their arcade machines. Their home consoles and everything else that was supposed to be supplemental income, but it was siphoning the money that their arcade division was making. So if they had just been an arcade company in the 90s, they would have been hella profitable. But their home division is what was flushing their money down the toilet. So the design philosophy of the Dreamcast was outdated. It was arcade first, and okay, PC games, story-driven games, were sort of an afterthought. Now, midway through the console's life cycle, Sega realized they fucked up. They put too much of an emphasis on arcade games, Mortal Kombat Gold, Soul Calibur, House of the Dead, Virtua Fighter, etc. And gamers were like, yeah, I'm over it. Give me something with a little more depth. And so Sega invested, at the time, an exorbitant amount of money to develop an open-world, story-driven game in a fully 3D world, Shenmue, which I will admit was a groundbreaking game at the time. Laid the groundwork for Grand Theft Auto 3, which was the game that took that genre and made it a household staple. Shenmue, on the other hand, was a flop. Nobody fucking bought it. And when I say nobody, I don't mean literally nobody. You probably did, and you're gonna let me know in the comments. But, like, not enough people bought it to fucking matter. It was a financial flop. So much so that Sega canceled Shenmue 2 and had to sell it to Microsoft to get it produced on the Xbox because they were like, yeah, we don't have the money to finish this fucking series that we started. And it was so underwhelming that they had to crowdfund to be able to produce Shenmue 3 20 years later. Now, I'll admit, Shenmue was a groundbreaking game at the time, and had it been supplemented by other, story-driven, open-world type games like the PlayStation and N64 were known for, gamers might have, flocked to the Dreamcast. They would have been like, oh yeah, this is awesome. But instead, what we got was, out of the roughly 250 plus or minus games released for the Dreamcast, 70% of them were our fucking arcade ports. The rest of them were just sloppy third-party ports of PS1 and N64 games where it was like, oh yeah, prettier graphics, but I need more than that. And it was a lot of like, the fluffy stuff, like Tony Hawk's and, the Resident Evil 3 and stuff like that. It wasn't even like the mainstream stuff. Like there were no Metal Gear Solid. There was no, there was nothing on par with Final Fantasy 7 or 8. There was nothing on par with Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. There was nothing comparable to these big open world story driven games that we had just been introduced to as a gaming community. We were like, yes, we want more like this. And Sega was like, don't you want Typing of the Dead instead? And we were like, what the fuck is Typing of the Dead, you assholes? Jesus fucking Christ. Fucking an edutainment game? Are you fucking kidding me? Not only is it an edutainment game, it's an edutainment game based on, at the time, an outdated arcade port. House of the Dead was released on the Saturn, for Christ's sake. How are you gonna convince me to pay $300 for a Dreamcast to play a game I can already get on the heavily discounted Saturn at the same time? Which, by the way, it was like pointless to buy a Saturn at that point because it was like, well, they're not making games for it anymore. I'm not going to invest in Dreamcast at the time, and this was literally what I told my friends. I was like, I'm not going to buy a Dreamcast because it's not going to last, because they didn't support the Saturn, they didn't support the Sega CD, they didn't support the 32X, they didn't support the Game Gear. They have a history of abandoning their fan base. Why should I trust them? I was one of those Sega nerds who abandoned Sega when the Dreamcast came out because I was not convinced. And more people were like me than who weren't, because the goddamn thing was a fucking flop. Now, I'm not saying you can't be sold on the Dreamcast or can't enjoy the Dreamcast. I'm just telling you why me and the vast majority of people didn't like it. Because it was inferior to what was coming. It was subpar compared to what it was up against. It had an outdated gaming philosophy by a company that had a history of abandoning its hardware, and it was struggling to attract third-party developers because the third-party companies who made arcade games that would have ported those games to the Dreamcast had already stopped making arcade games, so they had nothing to port to the Dreamcast. There was nothing to play. Now, I know you got a few quirky Sega games like Jet Set Radio and, Phantasy Star Online and, like I mentioned, Shenmue. You got the absolutely amazing, and I will sing its praises all day long, Sonic Adventure. One of the best 3D action, I want to say platformer type games ever. Not quite as good as Mario 64, but almost as good as Mario 64. Better than most 3D platformers that were on the N64. So it had one mega hit. It just wasn't enough. Fortunately for me, I was able to get a superior version of that game on the GameCube just a year later. When it came to the GameCube, I was able to get Sonic Adventure DX, which was, the superior version of the game, and I didn't have to waste $300 on a fucking Dreamcast. Now let's talk about the console itself, why it wasn't impressive at the time either. For one, it looked like a shoebox. No, it looked like a Kleenex box. It looked like a fucking toy. The controller is probably the worst video game controller ever conceived. Worse than the N64 controller. I'll say it. Worse than the Intellivision controller. Worse, I'll say it, than the Atari Jaguar controller. It is the worst home console controller I have ever held in my hands. You cannot enjoy the video games, even if they're enjoyable video games, if the controller is a piece of shit, which it was. So even if it had good games to play, they wouldn't have been fun to play because of that fucking controller. Did it have any alleged innovations? Yes and no. The 4 controller ports was not an innovation because it had already been done in 1982 on the Atari 5200, and it had already been done in 1996 with the Nintendo 64. So even that wasn't an innovation. The optical disc drive. It used something that Sega referred to, I believe they called it the GD-ROM, not CD-ROM. To this day, I don't know the difference between a CD-ROM and a GD-ROM. Allegedly, it held a whole gigabyte instead of 800 megabytes. But it's my understanding it did that by removing the error protection and copy correction that was needed to make games, playable. So it was like, yeah, you could fit a couple extra 100 megabytes on the disc, but was it worth it when it's, competitors had DVD drives that held between 4.7 gigabytes and 8.5 gigabytes? No, it wasn't. Yeah, I know, the GameCube only had 1.5 gigabytes, but that's still 500 megabytes more than the Dreamcast. Let's talk about the VMU, the other alleged innovation. Technically, you could argue the VMU was an innovation because it was a memory card that plugged into the controller that allowed you to transfer micro data to the unit, and you could disconnect the unit from the console and play mini games on the VMU, the video memory unit. But that's not much of an innovation, considering we already had memory cards built into the controller on the N64, rumble packs, etc. And the N64 had an accessory that plugged into the rumble pack, or the memory card slot, that let you play Game Boy games. So even that wasn't the VMU, oh yeah, I can play fucking Game & Watch games. Alright, technically innovative, I guess. Impressive? Fuck no. Plus, the GameCube did it better with their connectivity, which again was way more fleshed out. So why would I invest in a Dreamcast when here comes the GameCube right around the corner that's going to do it better anyways? So no, that wasn't much of a innovation. Now, allegedly, technically, the Dreamcast is the first home console released in the US that had internet capabilities built in. This is technically true. However, it was not the first home console to have internet connectivity. The NES had internet connectivity in Japan, so did the SNES. The Genesis had internet connectivity in the US via the X-Band. The Saturn had internet connectivity. So no, it was not even close to the first online console. Not even close. And you can't even argue it was the first, quote, mainstream console to feature online connectivity because it wasn't mainstream. It didn't sell worth a shit. So you can't even call it mainstream. So even that alleged innovation is false. Now, I'm not here to say the Dreamcast is a piece of shit and you shouldn't own one or it's not worth buying or collecting for. We'll get to that video in another day. I'm just giving you my reasons in 1999 when it was brand new why I wasn't impressed and wasn't interested in it in 1999, why I wasn't sold in 2000, and by 2001 when it was discontinued, I had already moved on. I have personally never owned a Dreamcast. It is the only Sega hardware I have never owned. I've even owned the Saturn. I've even owned the Nomad. I have never and will never own a Dreamcast. Will never. I have no interest in it, ever. Because once you get the vastly superior ports of the Dreamcast games that are on the PS2, Xbox, GameCube, which you're going to buy those systems anyways, there's not much left on the Dreamcast to justify it. Because what is left, I can already get on the N64 or the PS1. And the arcade games, I'm not going to get excited for Typing of the Dead, goddammit. There's nothing you can do to get me excited for that. Nothing. You know, to me, the Dreamcast was a failure for a lot of reasons, and they were all justifiable reasons. Because at the end of the day, it served no legitimate purpose, it filled no need in the market, and it didn't appeal to anyone outside of, like, die-hard Sega fans. Which I was, and even I wasn't sold. So, yeah, fuck the Dreamcast.